Okay, good morning. It's 10:01, so I think we're just gonna assume that we're ready to go here. And because it is a webinar format, I can't see any of your faces, but it is nice to see your names as you filter in. I should say up front that unfortunately my colleague Megan was not able to join today. She had another really important meeting that came up, so it's just me today. But my name is Kate Bitz. I use pronouns like she and her. I am a program manager and trainer organizer with Western State Center in our Momentum program. And what that means is that day to day, I do organizing and research in the context of helping communities figure out how to counter white nationalism. I was really excited to get this request to develop a training on conspiracy theories because I think it's a fascinating and disturbing subject, and I'm really glad to be here to talk with you all today, either using the Q&A function or using Whova. We'll all figure this out together. So next slide, please. Just to start out and tell you a little bit about Western State Center, which is a partner organization of this summit today. We are based in the Pacific Northwest. Home base is Portland for the organization. We work nationwide to strengthen inclusive democracy so that all people can live, love, and work free from fear. Next slide. And this is just a quick note that I always do for my presentations. You know, obviously, this is not going to be the most pleasant of subjects. It can be a little stressful to think and talk about all of this stuff, especially in a time when we are dealing with rising hate violence of many kinds in our country, in our region, all over the world. So I completely understand if this turns out to be a little bit unpleasant. Obviously, I see no issue with you popping in or out. Using a second screen to find some cute pictures to distract you for a minute, whatever you need to do, definitely do it. I should also say that I'm not going to be showing any imagery that is violent or disturbing, but there is going to be some anti-Semitic imagery in the presentation today. That's not chosen to shock or disturb you, but just to kind of show you some historical patterns. So that's that on that front. Next slide, please. And here's kind of a little bit of what we're going to talk about today. So first, we're going to talk about what even is a conspiracy theory. How do we recognize this when someone is promoting a conspiracy theory to us? What is the history of this? What does it have to do with discrimination and bigotry? Then we'll get into some really contemporary stuff, talk a little bit about what QAnon is, how it fits into the long history of conspiracism. And at the end, I'm going to make a stab at suggesting some ways that people can get involved in improving the situation. So next slide, please. Let's get into it. What is a conspiracy theory? Next one. So first, let's just ground ourselves in what a conspiracy theory is. How is this different from other ways that people understand the world and form our beliefs about reality? A conspiracy theory is a baseless belief that secret plots and agendas are the main force driving world events, right? So this often posits that the seemingly random events and effects that we're all subject to are partly or entirely directed by malign forces who are looking for more control over our lives. This is something that the historian Frank Mintz referred to as a conspiracist worldview. If this is something that you believe, that is conspiracism. You know, this is obviously really operative when we think about things that are probably random, such as a global pandemic. There are many people who are just not really comfortable with the idea that sometimes bad things happen, that events just occur and our lives are just changed. Next slide. But I guess the question that I often get when we're talking about this subject is, isn't there such a thing as a real conspiracy? And I mean, of course, there are real conspiracies that have an influence on important events. For example, we've seen multiple indictments on conspiracy charges come down against like members of the Oath Keepers, who are a far-right paramilitary group, for planning and carrying out violence during the riot at the US Capitol back in January. So conspiracy charge isn't a conspiracy theory, and it's not really conspiracist thinking to take note of the fact that a group like this, animated by their anti-democratic belief system, did engage in a plot to storm the Capitol. But what's the difference? To understand a little bit more about that, let's take a quick look at the difference between two different ways of evaluating evidence on the next slide here. So one way relies on some testable hypotheses about the world, whereas the other relies on unfalsifiable beliefs. Let's do a little comparison about how these different ways of thinking could lead us to similar conclusions about the Oath Keepers. Next slide. So this might be a testable hypothesis. I might call up my coworker on January 7th and say, hey, remember how Stuart Rhodes, who's the founder of the Oath Keepers, was saying he would send his members to guard the polls during election time? Well, let's see if they might have planned to attend the rally on January 6th. That's something that we can look into. It either happened or it didn't. Whereas an unfalsifiable belief, if I'm just talking informally to my friend, next slide, might be the Oath Keepers are just a really terrible organization. They do really bad things, so they must be the ones behind this. Next slide. A testable hypothesis might also be taking a look at the evidence informing beliefs out of that. So say I'm reading through these indictments and I can see a high level of coordination. I can see their text messages, it's proven that they were coordinating around this. Whereas an unfalsifiable belief would be, I've just always said that these far-right groups are going to try and overthrow the government. So if we go to the next slide, the main issue with unfalsifiable beliefs is not that they always lead us to the wrong conclusions. Sometimes they can be something that we're correct about, but they do leave us vulnerable in terms of how we take in and evaluate new information. Next slide. So one of the biggest problems with conspiracy theories, and one of the biggest red flags that you're being propagandized by someone who is promoting them, is that those who promote this don't encourage their followers to adjust their bedrock belief in the theory based on new evidence. Instead, the evidence, even contrary evidence, just gets shaped around the pre-existing belief system. So for example, people who are entrenched in the belief that the Earth is flat are not swayed by high-definition pictures of the globe from space, or by personal testimonies from astronauts who have seen the Earth from space themselves. Conspiracy theory promoters will just explain that these pictures are faked by government agencies that are part of the conspiracy, and that astronauts are lying or brainwashed. Even in absence of evidence, or the high quality of the evidence against the conspiracy theory, can be twisted into proof that the conspiracists must be especially nefarious and very highly skilled at suppressing or faking evidence. On a side note here, I picked this example early this year in January. I just figured I would start out by talking about a group that really doesn't have a serious negative impact on society, because I wanted to keep this a little lighthearted. But by the end of that month, it turned out that a pharmacist who intentionally spoiled COVID vaccines believed in a flat Earth and thought he was protecting people by destroying those doses at a time when they were very rare. So it really goes to show that none of this is a joke. Next slide. So what's the harm of conspiracy theories is also a question that I hear a lot. Isn't it just fine for people to believe what we want to believe, even if it's a little bit goofy? Unfortunately, though, this does have real effects on how people see politics. Conspiracy theories do teach us that change is out of reach, right? This graphic is from a QAnon promoter who used to work in fashion and now makes a lot of his money drawing these diagrams that really connect all kinds of different disparate things and essentially show a web of things that is less a map of power dynamics and more just flattening everything onto one level that makes it seem like it's just impossible to fix or change anything. So this kind of incomplete power analysis not only leads people to scapegoat random other people or marginalized people on purpose for bad things that are happening in the world, it also just kind of leads people into a rabbit hole of unclear connections that really does not help folks understand how do we make positive change in the world. Next slide. And there's also really this long-standing structural relationship between conspiracy theories and bigotry. These kind of beliefs are really not new to our society. Some particular kinds of conspiracy theories do raise their head more frequently than others also. Next slide. So for example, we can trace a common theme in the most powerful modern conspiracy theories, anti-Jewish bigotry, all the way back to medieval Europe, when the Black Death was ravaging city after city. A lot of prominent leaders blamed the plague on their Jewish neighbors, falsely claiming that Jews were immune to the Black Plague and conspiring to deliberately poison city cisterns and village drinking wells in an effort to bring down Christendom. This conspiracy theory had deadly consequences. As it spread, thousands of European Jews were murdered, tortured, or expelled from community after community across Europe during this era and following. This was the beginning of a very negative pattern that has played out through the centuries even to today. It's a convenient tendency to assign blame to marginalized people for problems in a given society. Next slide. So today's most potent conspiracy theories are patterned after and gain much of their power from this ancient blueprint for conspiracy thinking. Blaming a disempowered or less empowered minority community is a common trope of conspiracy theories, and blaming Jews in particular is really part of the DNA of contemporary conspiracy theories, even if it's hidden deep in the arcane details of the theory itself. This pattern established itself in contemporary Western society as well. And in the early 20th century, anti-Jewish conspiracy theories emerged again via the worldwide publication of this fabricated text that you've probably heard of, called The Protocols of the Elders of Zion. It claims to be notes from a meeting of a group of Jews, and it claims to be proof that there is a Jewish plot to take over the world. This text has been proven to be fabricated, but it was still promoted by major figures in Western civic life, including media publication in Germany and the UK. 500,000 copies were printed and circulated in the United States by Henry Ford. The protocols made the news as recently as March of this year, when a US Capitol police officer was suspended for having a copy of this document visible at his workstation in the Capitol building. Next slide. And this pattern of deflecting blame for social and political upheaval onto a mythical global cabal of power-hungry, Christian-hating Jews, this is a reliable feature of contemporary far-right conspiracy thinking. We saw it also in the midst of the Cold War when conspiracy theories emerged alleging Jews of being behind communist revolutions around the world. We know that white nationalist conspiracy theorists even managed to attribute the successes of the Black American-led civil rights movement to what they describe as quote unquote Jewish puppet masters. And today we can also see anti-vax movements blaming Jews as a whole for the COVID-19 pandemic. Next slide. This anti-Semitic pattern repeats itself again and again in modern conspiracy thinking, even when Jews are not explicitly named. Obviously, this is something that is often coded to draw in more followers and prevent conspiracy theories from being seen as dangerous. Conspiracy theories that allude to an organized global cabal or an international circle of people who own the media and banking industries and have evil or nefarious intent, especially regarding children. Those are all anti-Semitic dog whistles that trade on these centuries-old false tropes about Jews. Unfortunately, it is the foundation for modern conspiracy thinking. All right, next slide. So what is QAnon? How does this fit into the picture? QAnon is a far-right conspiracy theory that centers around the patently false premise that Democrats, high-profile celebrities, and philanthropists are secretly running a sex trafficking ring involving children. Next slide. And here you can actually see the first post that the person or people who called themselves Q put up on a message board called 8chan. So essentially, the idea here, and this person was not the only one talking about these types of subjects on this particular message board back in 2017. The idea here was that essentially Trump was engaging in secret actions to ensure that his political enemies were going to be arrested and or executed en masse. This is something really important to understand about the background of QAnon, in that people who subscribe to this are really looking forward to the day when their political opponents are going to be either arrested or even killed. Next slide. So for a long time, QAnon was a fringe theory. It almost exclusively existed online, but it has expanded its reach over the past year, due in part to Q followers widening this conspiracy and continuing to inject their talking points into discussions about current events. By the time of 2020 campaign season, this is probably when a lot of people first heard about this conspiracy theory. People were showing up at Trump rallies to propagandize. They were holding these signs in order to encourage people to Google this and find out about it for themselves. You know, do your own research, as people who are trying to point observers to biased sources will often suggest. And this also started to kind of apparently reach some of the highest echelons of the Trump administration. People who had been involved beforehand at a very high level, like Michael Flynn, have signaled to QAnon believers, attended their events. All of this stokes belief in this theory's legitimacy. And often it was kind of a dog whistle signal, you know, using some of the slogans that they use, which Q believers take as a hint that the people involved not only fully understand the conspiracy theory, but subscribe to it themselves. Next slide. This also, in the course of the pandemic, merged with, oh, could I get the next slide, please? Thanks. This often soon merged with alternative health movements in the course of the pandemic, and this drew in more women recruits to QAnon. So this longstanding discourse of health misinformation and anti-vaccine sentiment had already primed wellness subcultures to question public health precautions and believe that every, pharmaceutical innovation is actually created in bad faith, this type of thing. This created a big opening for QAnon believers to start recruiting people out of those alternative health subcultures. In order to hasten that process along, whoever is posting as Q online explicitly instructed followers to stop using QAnon-related hashtags in summer 2020. The hashtag Save the Children then started to take off partially as a specious rejoinder to protests for racial justice. So if last summer you were out protesting or talking to your friends about racial justice issues, and you were told, for example, why don't you care about child trafficking? This was kind of an outgrowth of that, whether the person talking to you about that truly knew it or not. This also really changed the aesthetics of what was going on. So as you can see in this Instagram screenshot, it shifted into a more consumer-friendly, more aesthetically pleasing type of presentation, which a researcher named Marc-Andre Argentino has called pastel QAnon. Next slide. This also started to spread internationally. This is partly because far-right groups across the West share a really unified discursive frame on politics nowadays. So conspiracy claims will often make their way into different countries and different contexts. The picture you can see here is from Berlin. And it was certainly unsettling to see people, even in other countries, seeing the former president as this kind of savior figure who was saving children secretly, who is going to lock up all of his political opponents. A lot of people were very confused to see this spreading internationally because it seems like it's so based in the American context, but it is based on these shared prejudices and cultural mythologies, many of them with an anti-Semitic background. So as surprising as it did seem at first, there's clear reasons why this would spread over to Europe. Next slide. Yeah, and then came January 6th, right? So at the same time as the first members of Congress who've espoused QAnon claims were entering office and taking their oath, supporters of that same theory stormed the US Capitol. Indictments continue to show that along with more organized groups like the Proud Boys, various paramilitary groups like Three Percenters and Oath Keepers, QAnon believers do make up a significant percentage of those arrestees. Next slide. It's also gone pretty quickly, and if you're following the discussion around a potential Senate resolution for a bipartisan commission to look into January 6th, you know this. The far right is quickly reinterpreting that insurrection and is pivoting to new ways of building power. So this idea of a stolen 2020 election is being very aggressively pushed to voters. Right-wing organizers are attempting to politically target elected officials who showed less than total fealty to Trump after January 6th. Some of the issues there have involved, Republicans who voted for the second impeachment. Some of those issues have involved anger at Republicans who voted for the bipartisan commission. The other thing that is happening with these claims of widespread voter fraud is that they're building up the justification for hundreds of proposed and some now passed state laws, which would drastically restrict voting rights. So here you can see how conspiracy claims of things that did not happen, such as mass voter fraud, are leading to real changes in the law that will be real restrictions on marginalized voters in our country. Next slide. So that does not paint a very pretty picture, does it? The question that I'd like to shift to now is, what is next and what can we do about it? So next slide. One thing that I have opened with in this presentation and that I really want to focus on now is the fact that there is nothing special about people in progressive movements, members of marginalized communities, folks who work for civil rights nonprofits that ensures that we ourselves can't get sucked into conspiracist thinking. So one thing we can certainly do is work on learning the difference between actual research and not so rigorous research. We really have to keep critical thinking in mind when we're looking at power dynamics in politics. Drill down into specific situations, stay really critical of our own assumptions, and realize when we are bringing our own unfalsifiable beliefs to bear on a situation. This is something that I tell community-based organizers all the time, right? If your research is not good, if your organization ends up publicly making claims that you can't back up, that causes you to lose credibility, and it also damages your own ability to figure out the best way to go about influencing local politics. If you believe that people are connected who aren't really connected, it's going to be very hard to plan an organizing campaign. That makes it so important to normalize rethinking our beliefs and taking in new information as it comes in. I think we've all got something to learn about that. I'm sure that we've all led ourselves down a garden path or two in the past. Next slide, sorry. Another really important factor here is we need to hold our institutions accountable for enabling conspiracy talk and really pay attention when they start pushing implausible claims themselves. So one of the claims last summer that were coming from a lot of different places was this idea that Black Lives Matter protests were not being led by local people, especially in small towns, and that they in fact were being whipped up by so-called outside agitators. This is a term that has a history of its own in terms of civil rights organizers of the 1960s and 1970s being referred to as outside agitators who were simply whipping up problems in communities that, that were essentially peaceful. That, of course, is very rarely true. Every community has its own problems. However, as these conspiratorial ideas hit the mainstream nowadays, we are seeing an uptick in elected officials and law enforcement increasingly reaching for these ideas as simple explanations for complex local problems. That's really not acceptable. So in this particular situation in my town of Spokane, Washington, our sheriff and police chief some windows were broken at a protest, and they decided to focus on this idea that clearly this must have been people from out of town. There was a widespread idea that it couldn't just be regular people from Spokane who, for their own reasons, felt that it was justified to break a window. That did not pan out. People who were subsequently arrested were mostly young people from our own town. However, using this outside agitator talking point was a great excuse to avoid discussions about why someone might choose to make that poor choice during a protest, right? There needs to be more accountability than that. Local leaders have got to be using their platforms responsibly, and we do need to have that hard conversation about why a young person would decide that's what you do at a protest. Next slide. Another really important thing for our own work is to focus on very real issues and work for the common good. So conspiracy theories advance this blame game. They use marginalized groups as scapegoats. They also let bad actors off the hook for their harmful actions. It's really striking during the pandemic to see that a lot of organizing energy now has to be spent on trying to counter folks who believe in completely false crises that are not actually happening, rather than handling the actual crisis, right? We have medical personnel who are on the verge of burnout. We've got all of these problems with schools. Service workers are organizing to try and get better conditions after dealing with low pay, no benefits, and inconsistent work for the past year. Folks are facing eviction, and yet here we are talking about a completely made up cabal of child abusers. That's really disappointing. It's so important to provide political education for our communities that cuts through all this nonsense and also embraces that community power to make a change, advancing a positive vision and really getting us to a place where people are doing better, actually materially doing better. Next slide, please. This pandemic has also really shown that conspiracy theories have reach, right? A lot of people have gotten involved in some of these beliefs. I have seen them, for example, spreading to groups locally that do some very serious work against sexual violence. Not all of them understood the background of things like the Save the Children hashtag when that started to come up. I think it was very, it was intentionally confusing to people. I certainly saw some folks starting to spread around that conspiracy content without understanding the background of it. And there were probably a few reasons for that, right? It is hard when we're used to crowdsourcing our information, and when there are counter narratives that are so important to pay attention to, which only come up or at least start on social media. Those are certainly real things that are important for people to spread around. But if some of the trusted sources that we use for crowdsourcing start to go in a conspiracy flavored direction, it's also really easy for that information to start spreading and creating real problems. So one thing that we also can do is set a standard in our communities when it comes to sourcing information, make sure that we're talking to just a lot of people about what they're feeling and experiencing, keep a close eye on social media. And we can also do what we can to keep our people well cared for and well informed. This, I think, was a really powerful example of that, in which, not all of us can be glamorous yoga influencers, of course, but there is a large group of those influencers who decided to commit themselves to standing up against QAnon and really having those hard conversations amongst the people who listen to them, and making sure that people's feeds were not just full of nonsense about the pandemic, but also continuing to tell people correct information, keep their folks up to date, and ensure that social media was a useful resource for folks, even if they were also being exposed to some of that conspiracy-based content. Great. I feel like I kind of rushed through that, but I also want to make sure that we have some time for questions. So maybe what we'll do, are folks tending to use the Whova functions for questions, or would it be easier for you all to raise your hand or use the Zoom chat? And maybe the easiest thing to do here is raise your hand inside of Zoom. I will also be keeping an eye on the Whova chat as best I can. And Chris, my helpful tech support, please let me know if you see hands raised and I don't happen to see them because I'm in the other window.
It was disabled, but now participants should be able to raise hands.
Great, thank you so much. And again, either way is fine, but frankly, using the Zoom functions would probably be easier for me. Okay, Barbara, go ahead and unmute. I think I did just unmute you. Okay, here we go. Barbara, you're unmuted. Go ahead and ask your question.
I'm sorry, did you say that I'm muted?
You're unmuted, so we can all hear you.
Yes, did you hear my question?
I did not.
Ah, okay, thank you.
But I hear you now.
Okay. I'd appreciate it if you could speak a little bit more about how something goes from one post on social media to becoming a broad conspiracy. I think I just need to hear it again if you explained it and hear more. I mean, I kind of am focusing on, I believe you showed one post from somebody who called themselves Q, and then how that expanded. So
yes. This is a really good question because QAnon, as far as I understand it, is sort of a historical exception here. At that time, there were a lot of people making similar claims to be like national security insiders, telling all of these wild stories about how like Hillary Clinton was about to be arrested or something like this. And At first, people actually did not even take this person who was calling themselves Q seriously at all. It really seems to be something that was first crowdsourced of people began to find these posts more and more interesting. Maybe kind of in the way that if 3 new bars open up on your street in the same week, it may not quite be clear why people start going to one of the bars and it becomes very popular, whereas the other 2 close down. So part of it, I really believe, was just crowd dynamics. Another part of it, however, was that people who were already kind of, I guess you could call them conspiracy theory influencers, and publications that tended to already promote some conspiracy theories started to jump onto this. So I'm going to put a link in the chat that is called the QAnon timeline. And that's often what I'll rely on if I'm trying to remember, okay, where was this really at in like 2018? You know, who was promoting this? That should hopefully be helpful. However, it does seem that this took off somewhat organically and then started to be pushed by conspiracist publications from, for example, the John Birch Society. Different people started to repeat the claims behind QAnon about this idea of a secret cabal without actually labeling it as QAnon. And I think you also have to look a little bit at cultural tendencies in the United States. I'm 35, so I grew up during the time of the Satanic Panic. I don't know if other people remember this time of everyone freaking out about, if you play this record backwards, it will say, "Hail Satan," or Dungeons and Dragons is teaching children witchcraft. You know, a lot of this stuff is culturally similar to what people are claiming about celebrities today as QAnon believers. So I think you can also look at that as kind of things that people latched on and reasons why they found this whole idea somehow credible. I also see in the chat that someone was asking about the conspiracy theory definition. I will put a source that I used to develop this in the chat, which I found very helpful. How do you spot a conspiracy theory when you see one? And also in the chat, our executive director, who's giving the keynote later today, Eric Ward, wrote a few months ago about how conspiracy theories are affecting our national discussion in general. Mickey, I also see your question in the chat. How to talk to people in your lives about these? Well, this is kind of the $1 million question right now, I think. Because we are dealing with a rapid spread of these kinds of ideas. I think that for a lot of people, it is legitimately just difficult to evaluate this type of information and figure out what is and isn't really going on, right? So I would say that if people in your life are already very convinced of this stuff, that can be a very difficult conversation. A lot of people who had family members wrapped up in QAnon were hoping that, for example, the election results would show them that actually Donald Trump is not some kind of savior to children, but instead, you know, a one-term presidential candidate. That didn't pan out because these claims panned very easily into, you know, it just fed right into claims about a stolen election. So if someone's really entrenched, I think a lot of it is a question of where you want to put your energy, and are there ways to maintain a positive relationship and kind of give someone a ladder to potentially get out without spending a lot of your time talking about the actual conspiracy theory. If you're just asking, like, how do I make sure that people in my life are aware of this as a problem? I would definitely suggest sending them some good articles, There's also a great, let me see if I can find this for you. Otherwise, I will use the Whova app and put it in this session after we all get off the session. There's a great resource called First Draft News that really keeps an eye on and monitors some of this. It is aimed at local journalists so that they have some ideas of how to report on difficult issues like this. But I found it really helpful for organizing my community. All right, Leah, I also see your question about identifying and resisting pastel QAnon. This is a tough one in part because it is part of this very strong tendency of far-right content to take on whatever form will draw people in. So, you know, we often see, for example, far-right groups who wave the American flag. They're trying to establish themselves as just fellow patriotic Americans. But then when you look into the ideology, it's something much darker, right? This is kind of the framework that I would put pastel QAnon in. And especially, I think, as women, it is sometimes difficult to understand that we too can be essentially targets for recruitment, right? So if we're not used to being in that situation of someone sidling up and trying to convince us of a harmful and reactionary worldview, it can be easier for us to get sucked in just because we think that the classic recruit is like a 30-year-old future Proud Boy. I would say definitely do a little bit of reading. At this point, if you look up that term, you will find academic work on some of the ways that this started happening last summer. And another, you know, thing to keep in mind is that pastel QAnon, it totally jumps off of legitimate concerns about both healthcare systems in terms of, you know, people hoping that they can find ways to boost their immunity and avoid COVID, right? So one way is making sure that you're really validating things that you're doing for your health. Another way is to think about this in the context of, it really tries to exploit women's activism against sexual violence, right? If you are putting on an event that's called Save the Children, that is much more likely to tug at people's heartstrings and convince them versus going out there and talking about, you know, Donald Trump or talking about the cabal. So certainly, like, validate any events that are going on in your area that are starting to use some of these taglines like Save the Children. Another really good thing to do is just get involved in serious local organizing around preventing domestic violence, you know, getting resources to foster children, all of these things. There are agencies that have been working on them for decades. So one thing I really appreciated last summer was that there were a number of domestic violence agencies and also child protection agencies that started to put out fact sheets about what child exploitation and child abuse actually looks like in the real world. Sharing those kind of resources and informing yourself about how that really happens in our communities and how to really prevent it is certainly one way to make sure that you and your community are well informed, and also find real ways to make a difference. I hope that helps. Yeah, that too. I mean, critically analyzing incoming information is really important. It is something that I've gotten used to in my day-to-day because I constantly have people texting me about their concerns in the community. There are a lot of rumors that go around about, like, far-right demonstrations or, you know, neo-Nazi groups that might be organizing. And I will say, like, not all of those rumors pan out. So learning how to vet that kind of stuff, building relationships with people who have those vetting skills is all really, really important. Okay, we've got about 5 more minutes. Any more questions? I will also go ahead here and grab some of those first draft news resources. So here they've got what they call a vaccine insights hub, where they really track emerging conspiracy narratives month for month. If you ever hear someone say something truly bizarre, it's a good place to go look, and usually you can find not only the strange claim, but also where that's coming from. And what else did I say I would grab? Another really useful thing that some parents put together who work with Western States Center is a discussion guide about how to talk specifically to kids who might be getting exposed to this type of content. QAnon TikTok is unfortunately also very real and trying to bring in young people, for example. So this is like a 6-part, very involved guide to talking to young folks about some of this stuff. Great. Well, if nothing else comes to mind, I'm happy to close down 3 minutes early and let you all get over to your next session. But this has been really great. I will share my email in the chat. And if any questions come up afterwards for you, feel free to contact me. Great. Thank you all so much for being here. And thanks, Chris, so much for tech support. Have a great rest of your day, everyone.